bad world, and yet look at us all. We're all here. 9/11 happened just down a few blocks away. 11 years later, the city's going. Resilience. It's something, as one of our experts said, that everybody's interested in, partly because it's in our DNA. We're here because eons and eons of our forebears learned, evolved how to be resilient. So we all have a very close association with it. We'll all experience the need for it, whether we want to or not. The death of a spouse, car accidents, earthquakes, suicide bombers. How do ordinary people make it through traumatic events with their psyches intact? That's the question that we're going to be answering tonight, drawing on both science and philosophy. We want to explore whether science can identify what makes some people resilient. Is it genes? Is it a protein? In the future, could we bottle it, so to speak, make everyone resilient? If not, can resilience be taught by parents, by teachers, by something more than hard experience? Can we instill resilience in our soldiers? Should we? In our children? Should we? In all of us? Who in the course of our human lives face adversity and setbacks? We all do. And yet, unbelievably, inexpressibly, we're still here. We keep going. Clearly, there are secrets we have to learn about our strengths here. We have a distinguished group tonight to answer all of these questions. Let me introduce them. First, from Columbia University, welcome a psychologist whose writing has redefined conventional thinking about grief and trauma. He'd be the first to tell you that we are more resilient than we give ourselves credit for. Please welcome George Bonanno. Next, the director of the National Center for Disaster Mental Health Research at Dartmouth College. Our next participant has done pioneering work in post-disaster resilience in both individuals and in communities. She has also studied how long it takes to recover from trauma. Fran Norris. And next, please welcome one of the country's preeminent psychiatrists. He's a leading expert in the psychobiological basis for resilience to extreme stress. Through his work, he has studied characteristics of resilience in Vietnam prisoners of war. He just has a book out, which is going to be published very shortly on the same subject. Please welcome Dennis Charney. From the Mount Sinai School of Medicine. And finally, our final participant earned a PhD in cell genetics before choosing a life path as a Buddhist monk. He's a Frenchman who went to Tibet for 40 years. He's studied and practiced the art of resilience and happiness there. Please welcome Matthieu Ricard. So we have a full house, and to get started, let's anchor ourselves with some definitions. You each come at this from a different discipline. So I'd like to start by asking how each of you would define resilience. And if you have to define it briefly by what the lack of resilience might be, that might also help as well. George?
I define resilience as an outcome. So we have to have an aversive event, and then after that event, people respond. A resilient outcome is a stable pattern, a stable trajectory of healthy adjustment, functioning normally, as if the event didn't happen.
As if it didn't happen. We get back to some kind of normalcy.
We might have a brief interruption, but otherwise a stable trajectory of healthy functioning. There's another piece to that, but I'll add that later.
Give us a one-sentence thing of the other piece.
The other piece is that that outcome depends on the types of events, and there's two broad categories. One are isolated traumatic events in which we assume resilience is a kind of a stable response, and then we have these broader events like torture or chronic poverty, which we might expect a little bit of a different kind of trajectory, a longer time to return to.
All right, Fran, do you have
This is really a great transition here, because I would say it's not an outcome, it's a process, and it's not about stability, it's about adaptability. And in fact, there are some circumstances where remaining stable may in fact be the worst thing for resilience. But I would actually, I guess, more technically define it in a way that we would totally agree on, is that it is a positive trajectory of adaptation that happens over time. And by the word trajectory, I just mean the sort of patterns of change after an initial disturbance where things get bad, there is this move back toward a more positive state of well-being.
Dennis.
You know, we came to study resilience from a medical point of view. And it started by trying to understand why people who were infected with the HIV virus, some developed AIDS, in fact most, but some did not. Mm-hmm. They were resilient from a biologic point of view. So then we began to look at individuals who faced trauma in their lives, serious forms of trauma. And we began to define resilience from the perspective that some people who were seriously traumatized did not develop depression or post-traumatic stress disorder. So that was one definition. From
A negative definition. You don't have certain bad outcomes.
Don't have some bad outcomes. And another definition that we've been using is that some people do develop depression, post-traumatic stress disorder from trauma, but are able to recover. They are able to bounce back.
And that's resilience.
That's resilience too.
Bouncing back into a state that you can define with medical terminology or science.
And that's one way of defining it from a medical point of view. So you're no longer suffering from, say, a mental disease of some sort. You bounce back and you're now better, and in some cases, even stronger.
All right. Matthieu, from the Tibetan perspective, so to speak, what is your definition?
I would speak of a way of being that comes with a cluster of qualities, for instance, inner strength, inner freedom, inner peace, that give you the inner resources to deal with the ups and downs of life. That means you are neither indifferent or insensitive, but you are much less vulnerable. And so you know that you can face the ups and downs. You have this kind of confidence. So this kind of micro resilience after a sharp pain or something that's terrible that might happen, and your recovery time might be much faster. And there's on the larger scale, about the bigger events of life, that you can keep your bearing, like a cat always falls back on its leg.
So a kind of inner equilibrium?
Well, it's more an optimal way of being, and also one important point is, from our perspective, we believe it can be cultivated as a skill.
It can be cultivated.
Well, that's the
We'll get into that, but let me ask you another question. With the instant exposure to global events that the new communications technologies are bringing, so that we're all being exposed much more, is the discussion and understanding of resilience more critical now than it's ever been, or is there anything maybe not all that new about the fact that we're exposed on the screen so much these days?
I think mostly to avoid the wicked world syndrome, that we see so many tragic things happening and we feel a bit powerless and overwhelmed. So I think on that level, we need a kind of keep our bearing that we can do something on the individual level, but we just can't solve the whole world's problem. And I think the media has a responsibility in that. If you know that a 20-year-old American has seen 40,000 murders on TV, fortunately, I hope that not too many people saw a real life one. So that also changed the way we feel sort of aggressed by that, and we need resilience to that.
More stress. You were nodding, and then George, yes?
Well, the 24/7 news cycle can make it difficult for some people who've been traumatized and have, for example, developed post-traumatic stress, because one of the things that keep the problem alive is reminders. And so if you are continually being reminded of the trauma and the difficulties through news cycles showing earthquakes, tsunamis, violence, that can make the recovery more difficult.
So it's a modern problem that may be increasing. I saw a statistic the other day that said in 1970 the average person saw 500 ad impressions a day, and now the average person sees 5,000 because of the screens and everything. George?
Yeah, I would have added, or would add that I would argue that we're inherently resilient, and we've always been inherently resilient. That's why we're still here. But the reminders and the constant media attention has led to what we're doing tonight. We're now aware of it. I think through history, we've never really thought about it so much. And now we're saying, well, what is resilience? So we're at a point in our evolution, if I can use that word, where we're beginning to say, what is it? What are we doing? What works and what doesn't? Why? And I think that's, I would say, a positive thing.
So George, take us a little bit into what your research has been finding. I think you've been finding that humans are perhaps much more resilient than we think we are?
We've looked at it in the studies I've done. We've looked at all kinds of aversive events, from war, assault, cancer, traumatic injury. We recently did a study of spinal cord injury, and we track people over time, and we track the different trajectories, if I can use that word, and the resilient trajectory, the trajectory of stable functioning, healthy functioning, is always the most common. It's really a different story than we've kind of come to believe. That some people are traumatized and seriously disturbed and develop post-traumatic stress disorder. Some people take a little bit of time to recovery. But the most common pattern is essentially not being deeply affected. Maybe people are changed by the event, but they're still functioning quite well.
In other words, a lot of evidence that there's something natural in the evolved makeup of the human.
I would argue that because it's usually it's not only the most common, it's usually the majority. Most people show this resilient pattern, which suggests that we're wired in a sense for that.
I think I've seen one of the statistics from your research that says 40 to 50% are not resilient, but 50 to 60% are resilient, something like that?
Something like that. We've seen this across a huge range of studies.
Huge range of studies, geographical as well, particular groups?
We haven't done, there isn't so much international work because the scientific community just hasn't done that, but we've seen it across at least most of the Western world, a few studies in Asia. Yeah, we've seen it across all kinds of events.
Dennis?
Yeah, there's a great term, that, I think George knows about this term also, that Ann Maston, who's a researcher in the field of resilience, that she uses the term ordinary magic, which I think captures what George was saying, that, quote, ordinary people can show enormous resilience. But what I would add to what George said, however, is that it does depend on the trauma. In a sense, it's what we call a dose effect. So if a trauma is very severe and prolonged, the percentage of people that are unscathed goes down. And in some cases, very severe trauma, torture for a very long period of time, only 10% might not have sequelae that are serious. So it really depends on what you're facing in terms of how resilient you can be.
Yes, I mean, I really, really agree with that. It's kind of ultimately the result of some sort of interaction between these characteristics that we think are the strengths that people bring to an event and the demands that are placed on them. And we've known that for decades. I mean, that's not a new finding. But what always concerns me a little bit is that there's a little bit of a glass half empty, half full issue that goes on and on in this, that that's, people can feel such real distress after major events. And I think it's also important to recognize that distress is natural, and even to the extent of where sometimes it may look like disorder. But so that when we talk about or we define resilience as just all the time, stability, good functioning all the time, I think that the danger is in suggesting that it's not perfectly natural and normal to feel just awful.
Yeah.
After something bad happens. I mean, I'm currently involved in a study of parents whose infants and toddlers were killed in a daycare fire. And, they're not showing this pattern. I mean, it's now, we're almost 3 years out, and there's not a person in this study who is not still severely, severely distressed. And I don't want to say, oh, these aren't resilient people. They don't have good characteristics. It's just that they have gone through something that has strained the limits of people to get over. So.
I can't agree with that.
Okay.
Yeah, I can't agree with that. I think there was no event. Maybe torture. Torture sucks. Torture is really
Well, there is
bad.
an event.
But torture, and I don't think there's been systematic research on torture and the kind of research to really test this, but I don't think there's
No, that's probably good. But
I don't think there's an event.
I'm sorry, I just don't want to.
We have to do an experiment. No, I don't think there's an event in which you won't have at least, I don't know, 30%, at least a third, 30%, 35%, a third of the sample, a third of the group who will show resilience. I don't think it goes that
Well,
low.
a third, but I mean, okay, a third. But a third. And it's also partly a matter of where are you setting the bar? I mean, I actually know your research. You've set the bar low enough that it's not like, but I've seen. I'm sorry, that sounds backwards. But what I mean is that some studies of this, they'll define resilience as not having PTSD. I mean, that's way up there
Yeah,
to
sure.
say that just because you don't have post-traumatic stress disorder or a major disorder,
Yeah.
you're doing fine.
no,
I mean,
that's-
there
I
are
agree, yeah.
so many levels of just distress, feeling bad,
But the other
quality
thing-
of life issues
The
that,
other thing you,
that get missed in that.
sorry, the other thing that you said is crucial, though, and I think that's often left out. And I feel like even some of the work I've done fails to. Some of the work I've done gets misunderstood this way, and I think Dennis could probably speak to this more than anyone here. That most everybody, when a potential traumatic event happens, most everybody is unhinged, is disturbed, distressed for a period of time, about a couple hours, a couple days. And that is absolutely adaptive. That's why I think we're able to be so resilient. There are biological processes that go on.
Okay,
As I
that's
said,
good.
we have inborn mechanisms that are enacted at that time that kind of propel us forward, and they see us through in a sense. And then for some percentage of people, they just can't recover from that. But I think that's often left out of this.
And one question is whether our species has a genetic predisposition that gives us a variety of degrees of strength. Some people can't and some can.
In terms of the biology.
Yes.
Yeah, I think we're going to get into this more later,
Yes.
but
Yes, we will.
As a preview, on one hand, there's a genetic predisposition to be both vulnerable on one hand and resilient on the other to trauma and life stress. But genes are not destiny. And there's lots of research that shows how you're raised as a child, the challenges that you faced and overcame early in your life gives you a toolbox to do better. So it really is a combination of environment in its broadest sense and your genetic predisposition.
Your predisposition. Matthieu, I see you nodding at so much of this.
Well, I think there was a distinction to be made also on the challenge and the trauma that comes from being inflicted suffering, even you are an innocent person, and that probably it's easier to recover from that. I met many Tibetans that spent many years in the labor camps and were tortured, and because of their sort of inner strength, they went quite well through than to inflict suffering. I think that's much more traumatic. And the reason I say that is there's well-known studies that until the Second World War, it was found that only 15% of the soldiers in the front line were actually shooting at the enemies because they could not overcome the repulsion to kill another human being. And when they were heavily conditioned and trained, so that the percentage went to 80% in the Vietnam War, then you get 80% of people who had PTSD, much more. So the fact to have overcome something that is abhorrent, which is to kill someone else and inflict that suffering, that's a major, major cause which is much more difficult to overcome.
This is a very interesting point. I mean, the science, the military sciences have gotten much more explicit about needing to overcome natural resistance to doing something unnatural. And so you're suggesting there's a connection between this and the number of PTSD soldiers who come back because they had that broken down before they went in.
Yes.
Yeah, a good example, that's definitely true. One example that we've observed that support that is we studied the prisoners of war from Vietnam in quite detail. And they were held for 6 to 8 years. They were heavily tortured. They were put in solitary confinement and so forth. Yet the incidence of PTSD in that group was much less.
The ones who were tortured.
Who were tortured. They were being tortured,
Yes.
right? Their incidence of PTSD and negative outcomes in that group was much less than, say, the Vietnam veterans who were in combat and had to inflict harm on others.
That fascinating expansion of what we are being resilient from, what it is that we're overcoming, including our own actions and the horror we might feel at our own actions. Stanley Kubrick's movie Full Metal Jacket makes a very clear point of this, famously, of the need to break down natural resistance to turn people into killers because of the fact that afterwards there's the need to overcome that. All right, let's move along to the next question, which this raises as we begin to get into the medicine of this, into the biology of it, whether we can bottle resistance. We have a few little short videos that we can bring in. In this case, we want to try to analyze what's happening in our body during traumatic events and how biology and neurology are related to resilience. And with it, we want to share the story of a Peruvian immigrant who represents what a lot of us here have gone through, both normal life events and extreme surprises. We have a quick little video. Let's take a look.
Mi nombre es Rosa Montesinos, yo soy de Perú. Me mudé a este país agosto 23 de 2002, yo y mis dos hijos. Yo era médico veterinario, soy médico veterinario, yo trabajaba en una clínica y también tenía un pet shop. Yo estaba satisfecha como mujer, como madre también. Yo tenía una vida razonable. El motivo de mi mudanza fue específicamente un divorcio. A veces no quiero recordar eso, pero bueno, es parte de mi vida. Ha sido el dolor más duro que yo tuve. Mi mamá vivía aquí en Nueva York. Ella también me dice, ¿por qué no vienes? Vente con los niños por lo menos un año para despejarte de ese problema y después vamos a ver qué pasa. Tuve que tomar esa decisión fuerte para mí porque me deshice de muchas cosas, como les decía, dejando mi carrera, dejando todo lo que yo había logrado en los años de trabajo como profesional en mi país. En mi vida he tenido 3 golpes bien duros que hasta ahora lo siento. Uno es el de mi divorcio, el segundo golpe duro ha sido la muerte de mi madre y la otra que hasta ahora lo siento es de mi hermano. Una muerte repentina, una muerte inesperada. Él ha sido otro de mis apoyos espirituales. Aunque él vivía en Lima por teléfono, él siempre me daba ánimos. Es el carácter de mi madre, él. Mi madre murió de un cáncer en el bladder. Ella murió en 2006. Ella me decía, hija, tienes que ser fuerte, olvídate lo que fuiste, olvídate lo bueno, lo malo que tuviste y empieza a vivir tu vida y trata de hacerlo normal con tus niños. Y lamentablemente acá no puedo trabajar en mi campo como médico veterinario como lo hacía en mi país. No me gustaría separarme de mis hijos todavía porque ellos me necesitan. Yo tendría que ir a la escuela otra vez. Y otra, la situación económica que tampoco puedo enfrentar por ahora. Y también el idioma, que hasta ahora sigo luchando, ¿no? A pesar que yo estoy también yendo a la escuela, capacitándome. Entonces yo lo que pensé es, voy a tomar otro curso para que yo me pueda trabajar en este mismo campo. Mi meta por ahora es tener un grooming place. Eso quisiera, ¿no? Ese es mi sueño que ojalá se pueda realizar. Estoy ahora en el afán de hacer mi business plan. Y tengo esa esperanza de que si ahora estamos así, va a haber un tiempo que va a ser mucho mejor. Y yo soy optimista en ese sentido y digo, tiene que ser en mí mismo, creo en Dios, creo en las palabras que siempre mi padre decía, mi madre, y me acuerdo en ese momento de todo lo positivo. Y entonces afronto estos problemas.
So, a lot of questions from that. But let's start by looking, Dennis, at what's happening in somebody's body when they go through a course like that, which has so many aspects to it which are common in everybody's life.
Yeah.
Deaths of loved ones, unexpected deaths. What's happening in our body the second that the experience begins to unfold? What has your research shown?
So there is a normal stress response that we all experience when a stress happens, and they include adrenaline goes up, both in the brain and throughout the body, and that could be adaptive because when you're in danger, you want your adrenaline to go up because it focuses your attention and you get ready to fight or flight. That's the fight or flight reaction. What you're seeing on the screen now is the work of lots of researchers that have begun to map out in the brain what are the circuits in the brain that are involved in the stress response and a resilience component to that, and what are the neurochemicals. So you'll see on this slide that adrenaline is turned on, that's norepinephrine. Norepinephrine is counteracted by a naturally occurring peptide that reduces anxiety in the brain called neuropeptide Y. And I'll just mention, I can go on and on, but I'll just mention 2 other chemicals. There's a chemical called CRH, corticotrophin releasing hormone, which activates cortisol, which is an important normal response to stress. But when cortisol stays up, that's not good. It can make you vulnerable to depression. In men, testosterone goes down under stress, and it stays down for a long period of time. And that's something to consider when men are under very long periods of stress, that the low testosterone can have effects on the body. We've taken this work to try to see if we can, develop ways to, in a sense, biologically reduce anxiety and enhance resilience. This is a new area of research, and it's based on understanding neuropeptide Y. We did a study in the U.S. Special Forces, including the Navy SEALs, and found when the Navy SEALs were in their survival course, the larger the increase here in neuropeptide Y under stress, the better they performed under stress. So neuropeptide Y seems to be a naturally occurring anxiolytic neuropeptide, and a gene has been found for neuropeptide Y that when neuropeptide Y is not made in normal amounts can make you more vulnerable to stress.
So resilience in the sense of being able to perform under horrendous stress.
Yeah.
Short-term resilience.
Yes.
What are the long-term effects of these changes in the chemistry of the brain and indeed the structure of the brain?
If you're under very prolonged stress, you will get changes in neurotransmitter systems like serotonin, which I'm sure most of the audience knows is involved in depression, and stress can cause depression, probably by altering serotonin. And a gene has been studied that involves serotonin function in the brain. One form of that gene makes you more vulnerable to depression under stress, and another form makes you less vulnerable. So that indicates that genes are important in longer-term resilience under stress.
Matthieu, I noticed you nodding.
Yes.
Yeah.
But there are two comments I could say about how mind training can affect those parameters. We did a study with Richard Davidson in Nepal among meditators who are in the mountains and measuring the level of cortisol compared to a control group of people around. And we found it was less than half than the control group. I mean, they were much lower level of cortisol, which means a greater resilience to stress.
From meditating.
From being practicing meditation all day long. And then also, there is a very wonderful study about with Michael Meany that studies rats which have been selected for being extremely stressful. And the inbred line of rats, they're fearful, they hide everywhere, they jump all over the time. And if you put them the 10 first days of their life with over-caring mother rats that groom them, lick them all the time, the genes that express this stress are methylated. That means they are turned off for the rest of their life. For the first 10 days, and that's stable methylation. I mean, stable epigenetic change. That means the genes are turned on.
For the rest of their life?
For the rest of their life. Unless there's a very traumatic event, they will be normally not stressed. And interestingly, again, meditation, preliminary study shows that even 8 hours of meditation on compassion can already modulate the expression of genes.
So if you missed a little love, mother love early in life, meditation can help fill the gap now in some ways.
Right, and that work that was mentioned is so important because I mentioned biology and chemicals, but the work on meditation that you've done and others indicates that the capacity of the human brain is largely untapped.
Yeah.
The capacity of the brain is largely
The capacity of the human brain to change is largely untapped through mental exercises, meditation, specific psychotherapy, changes brain function. So the dichotomy between brain and mind is really a false one.
untapped except in certain places like Tibet. I mean,
Right.
2,500 years ago, you guys had the secret going already.
Well, we don't need to have 50,000 hours of meditation now. All the studies with short term show that in 8 weeks, you can already get a significant reduction of stress. You boost your immune system about 30%. So it starts right now.
Yep.
And this sounds like a delightful confluence of what Buddhists have been aware of and other meditative religious groups have been aware of for 2,500 years. You're finding the science is able to underpin what you've got another practical way of approaching.
What's amazing, we don't mind spending 15 years learning how to read and write and play chess and music and all that. And how come that we expect our mind will be optimal just because we want it to be so? The spoiled brat of the mind, we vastly underestimate the power of change. Why should it be compassionate, balanced, and so forth without doing anything about it. That would be so surprising.
Ironically, we were talking about this before. Ironically, what we found in the POWs who were held in solitary confinement for 4 years, so all they could do was think because they had to be silent. That their capacity for them to learn and remember, to do arithmetic, to write novels in their mind, was enormously enhanced when all they could do was think.
Was meditate. In other words, the prison imposed a kind of meditative discipline on them.
And mental exercise.
And mental exercise, which, for secrets you guys have known for a long time and which science is now finding out, help get the cortisol down.
And also it's a bit more methodical than just being thrown in a solitary confinement. You have a technique to do it.
George, I've seen you nodding here. I can think of 3 questions I want to ask you about what we're learning here from the scientists and from the Buddhists, but it's adaptive, isn't it?
Well, my thoughts as I was listening to them, I think this is wonderful. But from a scientific perspective, I think we actually know to some extent why, say, meditation would make you more resilient, in particular to potentially traumatic events, because we've identified the predictors of these trajectories, and some of them are things like having social resources, having low stress, having a sense of confidence in your ability to cope with events. And all of those are things we can measure. They're very simple psychological constructs that we can measure. We can show that they predict resilience. And it sounds like that meditation would increase all of those things. Meditation helps you keep stress down. Meditation gives you confidence in you said this before, confidence. And it increases your social connection. It does all these wonderful things. So meditating doesn't make you less resilient, just simply one-to-one, but it affects all these various factors that we know make you.
And I have another question. We're looking at the possibility of whether it's going to be possible somehow to intervene in the brain chemistry. Is it possible that if there's been damage with too much cortisol, we've read a lot in the popular press about how the cortisol going up rips your brain apart in some bad ways and the rest of the body as well. Is it possible to reverse that damage? To reverse it?
It depends on the severity. It has been shown that meditation and other forms of cognitive exercises can enhance brain function, change brain circuits. It's also been shown that certain medicines can reverse the effects of stress on what we call neurogenesis. That's the making of brain cells. So, yes, to a degree, but very serious forms of brain damage, like stroke, for example, maybe not as amenable.
You've done, Dennis, I believe, some clinical trials with PTSD patients well, tell us about that, your neurobiological work. I mean, the question really we're aiming towards here is, will it be possible at some point to make people resilient by giving them a pill or an aerosol spray? I mean, no?
Yes? I wouldn't go that far. I think there are so many techniques that we're hearing about today, and I think we'll hear more.
Put it in the water.
Put it in the water, right. Spray it on a crowd.
There are so many psychological techniques that make people more resilient. We're studying it more from the point of view that people who are vulnerable and have developed serious depression and PTSD, how can we facilitate recovery? And in that sense, we're looking at neuropeptide Y, which is that natural peptide that is involved in reducing anxiety. We can give it intranasally, and we're just beginning to test to see if giving neuropeptide Y reduces anxiety and helps PTSD.
Intranasal, that means a nose spray.
A nose spray.
To increase resilience.
I didn't say that.
No, so be precise then.
We're testing it to see if it can help people with PTSD recover.
Recover.
Treatment.
And recovery is not the same thing.
Yeah.
I don't see neuropeptide Y being a nasal spray you would get over the counter to make you a more
So
resilient
if somebody's doing poorly, this may be a way to help them.
That's the
recover.
beginning. Fran?
Well, my little comment there is that I think sometimes if you're looking at this from a public health perspective, and you need to kind of think about how the timing of interventions intersects with the phase of the process that someone's in. So the things that you do beforehand, I mean, for example, some of the things that you were saying about kind of training the mind could be viewed as potentially universal prevention approaches that could be done with everyone. There's other things that you want to think about. Okay, this is what you need to do right after an event that, well, it's too late to keep someone from not responding at all, or better yet, to not have the event at all. But we can really boost resilience by providing these resources right now. And then later on, and sort of ideally, right? Ideally, then everyone's resilient because you've done this, and that's the end of it. But of course, we know that's not the case. Some people will continue to have problems, and then you get into the realm of, okay, what do we do now to help those who have not yet recovered? And that's where it's just as important to think about treatment and longer-term interventions for those who have not been resilient.
There's one thing I just wanted to bring up, and I'd be interested in your comments about this. We saw Rosa, right? I believe that was her name.
Rosa, yeah.
And as she goes through all her traumas, and then she says, but I'm an optimist.
Yeah.
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah.
What we have found across many different groups and cultures, that optimism is a very important part of resilience.
Huge.
It's a part of resilience.
It's
Part of resilience.
that whole, yeah.
Some people seem to be born optimistic from day one, but I think you can make people somewhat more optimistic.
How?
I'm going to ask you to answer that.
Well,
Certain forms of therapy can do that, but I'd be interested in what you think.
optimism is seen as something, seeing everything with a silver lining, you're naive and so forth. It's not that.
That's not
No.
that.
It's about seeing a potential for change. If you say, I'm hopeless, this is like that, I'm wired like that, my baseline is just on the floor, I'll never make it, of course you'll not even try. But if you think there's a potential for change, even it takes time, even the journey is long, then you will, step by step, you'll be happy to do that journey. So it's very important. Real optimism is identifying that potential for change.
Identifying the potential.
And then do whatever is needed.
There's a very interesting TED Talk right now by someone named Tali Sharot called The Optimism Bias, in which she reports that they're finding that about 80% of people seem to be genetically predisposed to be optimistic and have this bias, and only 20% are. But again,
That's genetic? I mean,
or who knows? I'm not saying, there seems to be that a finding is, that whether it's
I do
genetic or not, of
agree
course,
with
will
I'll
be
give you
debated.
one example of a genetic optimist. There was a girl that we profiled in our book that I knew personally from when she was born. And she was born with spina bifida. And from day one, she was optimistic and can-do and was not going to let spina bifida, which is a disease of the spinal cord, get her down.
But that doesn't mean it was genetic.
Well,
I mean,
at
there's
least
not
she
a
was
thing
born
about
with it.
But no, it doesn't mean that, because it could be that from the very beginning she was raised by people who helped her appreciate all the other gifts in her life.
Not in this case, because I knew her parents.
Well, that's cheating.
And her parents admit that.
There is some truth to temperament.
And Tali
right.
Sharot, who
Certainly
you
it's true
mentioned,
to temperament
has
at the
identified
beginning.
the neural circuits of optimism in the brain.
Which are part of resilience and seem to be something we've evolved. Well, let's go to our next little video here to explore further two aspects of whether resilience comes with time as a result of time passing, or resilience comes as a result of character, which we'll begin to get towards some of these issues that we're talking about. So in this next little video, we're going to hear from a woman who suffered a trauma that you can read about every day in the obituary pages, which makes it no less life-altering. She had to face life after the death of her spouse. Let's take a look.
My name is Sondra Singer Beaulieu. I'm a writer, editor, journalist, and poet. And I met my husband in New York City at a party. A few years later, we met at the home of another mutual friend in a different city. And then from then on, it was for life. He had a radio program, and it was called Accent on Haiti, Caribbean Focus. I produced it for him. I think that as a team, we made things happen. Our marriage was probably the same as everybody else's marriages. We had our ups and our downs. We were two people who fell in love, and we were lucky that we stayed in love. Serge had been having difficulty walking and climbing subway stairs. We were living in New York, and he was diagnosed with stage 4 lung cancer. We'd been married over 25 years when he was diagnosed. And that night I was crying. And I said to Serge, I'm sorry. And he said, it's okay. He said, you can cry all you want. He said, I don't feel like crying right now. Maybe I will later. And that's the kind of relationship that we had. He even told a very, very close friend and colleague of ours, he said, you have no idea what I'm going through, but I'm hanging on as long as I can for Sondra. Now, I am not the kind of person that usually sees visions and things, but after he died, I saw him a few times. There was one time I was in bed and he passed by in the hallway outside my room, and he looked to see that I was all right. It was very comforting because I knew that he was still watching over me. There was another time when I saw him near the bed, and it was as if he were fanned out. There were multiples of him, and he had this warm, beautiful smile. And it made me feel good. And then the last time that I saw him was 4.5 years after he died, I believe. And when he looked at me, I knew before he walked off, that was him saying, I've done everything I can, and now it's goodbye. For me, I went on, I started to seriously write poetry and re-find the woman that he had fallen in love with so many years ago. It's been a journey for me to really re-find myself.
So, George, Sondra moved forward with her life, but in her own time. Is it helpful to think of resilience in terms of a timeline like that?
Well, we can think of everybody who goes through an event in terms of the timeline, of course. And in the research that we've done, we've mapped different trajectories of response. We tend to think, there they are. We think of this blue line as really as the resilient pathway. And these other trajectories are, they're different courses of recovery. The blue pathway, the bottom pathway is the resilient trajectory. And then the
35 to 65%.
35 to 65. This is across all the studies, usually around 50%. Then we have this recovery trajectory. Sometimes we see people getting a little bit worse, these delayed reactions, and sometimes people just simply not recovering at all. And we've looked at the different predictors of these pathways in many different studies now. What's interesting about it, and it's very interesting in light of the things we've been discussing, is that there are many different factors that add up to explain these pathways. And most of these factors, I might even say all of them, explain in a little piece of it. You know, if you have one of those circular diagrams, a so-called pie chart, and you put these different factors in, nothing is very big. So and including optimism. Yeah. Optimism is adaptive, certainly, but some people aren't optimistic, but they're still resilient, and that's because they have other things going for them. And these things interact in many different ways.
What kind of other things?
Oh, there's keeping stress down, confidence, social resources are enormous. So you can be a not terribly optimistic person, but have an enormous social world. There's coping, different attitudes of coping. Meditating, thinking of there's threat and challenge, thinking of something as a challenge rather than a threat. There are economic resources are huge. I think we underestimate all these things that are not so sexy as resources. But and it depends also on the type of event, what happens. So losing a loved one is very different than being assaulted, which is very different than finding yourself in a war situation or thrown in solitary confinement. All of these are enormously different. And what we're looking at is, I think, is one of the unifying factors is something we're calling flexibility, which is really the ability to say, what has happened to me? And what do I need to do to get through this? And it's different for every event.
Flexibility is a very interesting word. I've been looking at affect regulation psychology lately. Dan Hill is here, who is one of the people who promotes the understanding of this. And their definition of sanity in the affect regulation psychiatry world is increased flexibility with increased complexity. The more flexibility you have, I can see how that would fit in very well here.
It fits in, and flexibility is an interesting concept if you think about teaching people, because you can, I think, teach people to be flexible without ever mentioning resilience, without ever mentioning trauma, because it's just something we can be. And I think we're also, in Western culture, we've been hanging on the words of the ivory tower for academics for a while, and so we've thought we have to express our emotions. and we have to
Grief work, the Freud
we have
term.
to do work. We have to do grief work. We better not suppress anything. But all of these things, sometimes it's great to suppress emotion.
Really?
It's
That's very interesting.
Yeah,
Expand on
You
that.
cannot get along with another human being if you can't suppress emotion sometimes. You cannot resolve a conflict. You can't talk to the credit card people on the phone if you can't suppress emotion. You just sometimes have to just keep a lid on it.
We do have a sense that there's an expanding field of knowledge here
Just
about
one point
this.
there.
Yes?
That's really important in terms of when people are traumatized, that there was the notion that as soon as they've been traumatized, you make them express what happened.
Yeah.
And that was found to make people worse.
Because they're very vulnerable, it burns into their mind.
Yeah, exactly. It recapitulates the trauma, it makes the memories more intense.
And there might be a natural instinct in all humans when it's been very powerful just to be quiet. I'm reminded of hearing Elie Wiesel at the 92nd Street Y once in his annual talks about the Holocaust saying, of course, after the Holocaust, for a few years, the only possible first response was silence. Just let something go on that's taking care of it before you burn it in. It's a very interesting point. And indeed, after 9/11, we heard there were studies afterwards that were beginning to question some of the people coming down saying, oh, talk about it, talk about it.
I want to do that.
You don't want to do that. What do you do instead? Let people
You provide support,
To provide support, absolutely.
and you
What does that
listen when they're ready.
You link
listen when they're ready.
It's really actually
link
become
to their
very
natural
clear that,
networks.
after disasters, this idea of going in and talking to everybody, that the evidence consistently showed it didn't help and it sometimes made people worse. And the answer initially was, well, what do we do instead? And really, there isn't much we can do but provide support. If you go to countries where, for example, in the tsunami in 2004, Southeast Asia, when you ask people in those countries what they'd like, and you put a list of things they can rank, and you put mental health counseling on the list, it's down at the bottom.
Really?
Initially, they want help with rebuilding, food, shelter, taking care of their loved ones, finding their loved ones, figuring out how to rebuild the community. Maybe and mental health counseling and other types of counseling begin to come into play, a month or two later.
Fran, you're nodding an awful lot.
It can be integrated with those things. But I think, what I was thinking about partly that I think, to me, one of the lessons in this whole issue that arose surrounding what came to be known as debriefing is that this became an example to me of what happens when a particular style of intervention becomes almost mass marketed. This was an industry. No science. This was done in every fire department in the country for years and years and years before the first study had ever been done. It became a part of the culture, became a part of what was expected activities after disasters and even smaller events. And so then, once the studies started being done, it wasn't just a matter of having that knowledge, it was that there was now this whole infrastructure that had to be taken apart with a lot of bad feelings about that along the way. In fact, this concept of what's now sometimes called psychological first aid, in part emerged because it was like, well, if we're going to take something away, we have to have something. And so, what might we call just this notion of providing basic assistance, connecting people with their natural networks, and it might just be, a cup of coffee in a shelter, but not this idea of, okay, let's sit you down in a circle and make you tell me how you feel.
Yeah, I think what you were saying about expressing, you don't want to encourage rumination, because rumination is one of the main things that happen with depression. Constantly ruminating the past, anticipating the future, that's a recipe for feeling even worse. But about what you said about time, I think there's a possibility that the way you react with resilience of instant event, like pain, might be a predictor of how you will do well in long-term sort of trauma. And I give you an example. We did study with meditators with pain. And it can be electricity, it can be heat, we have been to all those things. And the main difference is that with sharp pain, the control subjects, when they know that the pain is coming, the brain areas of the network of pain is activated much before the pain, almost to the maximum. And then the peak is lost in that anticipation, and then it takes waves and waves after the pain. The difference with the meditators, no anticipation. They remain calm until the sharp pain comes, then they experience that pain very strongly, and after that it's gone. The recovery is very fast. So I think if you have the capacity to do that instant after instant, it will also probably predict that you can deal with your mind so that with bigger events, that you can always recover that kind of stability.
So just to be clear on here, the meditators were the ones who were able to deal with it, even though they were surprised by it.
But they were not surprised by that, but I mean, they felt the pain. There was not numbing the pain, but first they thought it was not so unpleasant, but they were not anticipating it, even they knew it was coming, and there was not the aftershocks, waves, during a long time. So they were less disturbed, they recovered right away, and they were not fretting about the pain before it happens.
Well, now, this is very interesting because it sounds like the opposite of something I believe I've heard from psychologists working with Vietnam veterans, that the ones who suffered worse PTSD were the ones who were not prepared before the war for the idea that they were going to have horrendous experiences. So in other ways, this is probably at a different end of the scale, but some of the soldiers who were more shocked and surprised by witnessing horrors had longer PTSD and less resilience.
Oh, that's true. I mean, so one of the things that the military focuses on
Training.
Is exactly, basic training and some training
For
after that
responders,
is
especially.
designed to take, an 18-year-old who comes from many different parts of the United States and prepare them as quickly as possible for what's going to happen in war. And it's been found the more prepared you are, the better you do. With the POWs, for example.
The more prepared you are knowing you're going to experience bad things.
Yeah, yes. I mean, you're prepared with what might happen, so it's not totally unexpected.
It's not the same, because here, what I mean, they are going to get the pain. It's not that you are surprised,
right.
But you don't panic before it happens. Yes. So you are undisturbed before, you feel the pain, and you are undisturbed after.
I think the way to integrate that is that preparation does help. For example, firefighters and soldiers have less PTSD than people who are exposed completely randomly. And the preparation does help with that anticipatory anxiety a little bit, because you know what's coming, the timeline. So a firefighter goes into a building where there are burned bodies. They know the sequence of events, and they know what it looks like and what it kind of feels like, so that I think the anticipatory anxiety is lessened. And
I think there's another aspect of that too, and it has to do with they are there because of a role, and they're making a positive contribution, as opposed to...
So it's got a meaning system around it.
Well, that's right, and there's a sense of controllability that enters into that as well, that the average person doesn't have an event. They're just the victim, so to speak, but when you're there by choice.
This is a really important topic, the issue of preparation. Yep. For example, in the World Trade Center, first responders, and George, you studied this too. Yeah. We found, we've been treating about 20,000 first responders at Mount Sinai. And we found that the first responders, like the firemen and the policemen who are prepared for trauma, develop much less psychological problems than the first responders who came from all over the tri-state area and elsewhere, to help remove the debris and so forth. They did much worse because they were not firemen and not policemen. And this has implications on how you prepare somebody for the inevitable tough things that we all face: loss of a loved one, divorce, and so forth. How do you prepare people as you raise your children for these inevitable difficulties? Yes. And there are techniques, ideas around that have been developed. So you have a toolkit of resources that you can call upon when the inevitable stresses happen.
Yeah, and I think that I bring up the concept of flexibility again, because I think it's a really interesting concept, and I think there's an educational component that comes with that, because I think we can really communicate that there are lots of different things you can do in these events, and it's okay to do those things. It's, and we often know what's the right thing to do, I think, but we just are not sure. And I think,
Well, in fact, the field of stress research went down this road for a long time, where everyone was studying ways of coping, and there was a lot written about whether this way of coping was better than this way of coping, and the results were really inconsistent, misunderstood, and in fact, someone finally went in and did a really good review of all this research and said, in fact, I think it was one of the people who originally invented the idea and said, this is trash. Let's just throw it out. We're not getting anywhere. And someone else was just at the same time really finding it didn't matter so much what you did is whether you felt efficacious, that you felt like what you were doing was making a difference. And that was kind of what he was calling coping self-efficacy in a way. And it's just an interesting concept to think that it really may not matter exactly what you do, as long as but it may matter that you have a repertoire, that you have different ways of styles to draw upon as you're dealing with different events.
All right, well, let's move on to the other half that we were talking about here of character, of whether character can make a difference. We have another little video. I want to share this story of resilience. A man who lost his leg in a landmine accident. He took that experience and went on to found a group called Survivor Corps and was eventually awarded the Nobel Peace Prize for his work to ban landmines. Let's take a look.
My name's Jerry White. I grew up in a relatively religious home, and I always wanted to go to the place where all this stuff happened. Jerusalem, the Sea of Galilee, these beautiful places where I could walk in the footsteps of the prophets. That was my goal. So when I was a junior at Brown University, I went camping in the Sinai and also into the Golan Heights, and that's where the accident took place. If you can picture a day, sunny, nothing could have been more beautiful, wonderful. I actually couldn't have been happier. I think I was even humming that morning when suddenly, boom. So I looked down after this explosion, and I see that my lower right leg was blown off. And I then was in shock, of course, and where's my foot? Where I couldn't get my mind to compute the loss. Where's my foot? Where's my foot? Where's my foot? And then when the dust settled and I saw that, my left leg was blown open and my right leg was in shambles, it dawned on us we're in a minefield left over from the 60s, from the Six-Day War. But it was in that moment of blood and fear and horror that I did have a recollection. For some reason, I knew I didn't die. I remember the first few weeks I was lying in a hospital in Israel. I was faced with a choice. Do I want to fly home to a hospital in Boston? My father happened to be president of one of the hospitals, and they thought, bring the boy home, we'll get the best care, the best doctors. And I said no. I was in a room with 4 or 5 guys my age who were blown up, missing eyes, limbs. They had gone through explosions in the Lebanese war. In Israel, it struck a little balance of being in-your-face, tough love, like, hello, that's life. We've been living with this for a long time. And so I was choosing to stay with people who understood what I went through, as opposed to going home and being precious. I felt like I moved forward and graduated. I resumed life. I really just wanted to do things I used to do, play tennis, go skiing, have girlfriends, figure it out. Did that, check. And I wouldn't say I was such a great giver back in the day, but the opportunity came up to help the survivors and the victims, the children, the families, the parents, the farmers, that they would have a leg up, an opportunity to move on in life. And so once I started, it was like a wildfire of giving. I think if we look back at our lives and you connect the dots of your crises or scarring moments, in fact, the universe is trying to wake you up, because each time there's an opportunity to awaken, I think spiritually, emotionally, physically, but as a giver in particular. So that's the interesting thing about trauma. Is it bad? Is it good? Who knows? What are you doing with it?
Dennis, I believe in your work you've come up with a list of character traits, a top 10 list of character traits that might make a difference. Can you share that a little with us?
So I got to know Jerry White through our work, and it was a real honor to work with him. And he exhibited resilience. And it started with a couple of things that he taught us, essentially. So he mentioned staying in Israel instead of going back to Mass General in Boston. And the reason he did is because he had role models there. And resilience, overcoming a trauma like his, does start in part with role models, meaning you look at other people, you see how they did it, and you incorporate that into your own mindset, and you move forward. So his role models were Israeli soldiers who lost their limbs, and that helped him on the road to recovery. Then what he did, and this gets into character, many resilient people are altruistic. They give back to others. So Jerry wasn't satisfied with now having girlfriends and moving on with his life. He decided to do something about it, and he formed the Landmine Survivors Network. Princess Diana got involved with that. He did it with Ken Rutherford, and that's when they won the Nobel Peace Prize. So having the character to not only recover, but now to give back and change society is part of a resilient personality.
You just call it a basic character trait that somebody might have been taught or taught by other role models when they were growing up.
Yep.
And there's a nice dovetail there with something that I know we've discovered. We're doing work with people who deal with refugee trauma in camps. They find that wanting to help out, there's also a psychological benefit. People who have suffered something want to then help others who have suffered the same thing. It helps them sort of own the experience, and it validates what they've been through as well, but by reflecting it back.
You see that in the veterans, right? And the veterans groups, when they help each other, they do better.
I think that component of altruism is essential.
It's absolutely essential.
Because, if you experience your suffering and the suffering of others in terms of what this does to you, and then how you react, you get the empathic distress, and this is a burden. The more they're suffering, the more you're broken down. But if you react with compassion and altruism, just like a doctor on the battlefield, the more they're suffering, the more you feel strength there's a compassionate courage, because the more there's to do, the more you want to do. So you don't feel it as the personal impact on you, but it motivates you to do more. So it completely changes your level of courage and resilience.
And indeed, is it not one of the basis, I don't know much about Buddhism, but that Buddhism understands existence as, sometimes it talks about it as a kind of suffering, as a way to start to understand what our common experience is, so that that leads you towards compassion towards someone else.
Well, suffering because, it's like a doctor. If someone is sick, there's no point turning our head away. We have to diagnose it, and then if there's a remedy applied. So it's an optimistic way of approaching that.
Right.
I have a little bit of an issue, and I don't want to overstate this, with the concept of character as being at the heart of resilience. It doesn't mean there aren't characteristics, but somehow character puts a spin on it somehow, that there are good people and bad people, and the truth of it is all of us have these characteristics to different degrees at different times in different circumstances with different stressors and so forth. And this, it's amazing the altruism that you see among disaster victims, among, you can't, I've identified trauma, and I'm sure there's at least one group of survivors that was started by someone who experienced the event and therefore started different kinds of groups like that. And in part, I'm not so sure it's because they had a stronger character, as this was one way of making meaning. This was one way of making something good out of the event, of finding a benefit, of trying to help others is a way to cope, is a way to move forward.
Well, Fran, you've studied a number of post-disaster communities in their different responses. Do you find that that some communities are more resilient than others? Is it a cultural trait? What have you found in your studies there?
That's a really big and hard to answer question, difficult to answer question in that form, because we don't quite know yet what that even means. Like, how do you capture what community resilience looks like? It's a question of great interest, and the reason why, if I could take a step back from that, is that so far in this discussion, and rightly so, I don't have any argument with anything we've been saying, but we've been approaching this as if resilience resides in us, in me, as a lone individual, when there are many crises that we face collectively and we have to deal with collectively. And that's where it breaks down, because my ability to cope and recover isn't just dependent upon my wonderful character, because I have wonderful character. It's also dependent upon everyone else. I mean, we have so many interdependencies. And so like my ability to recover from disaster also depends upon what is my community doing? I mean, I can no more prepare for that myself than I could decide, okay, now I'm going to educate my children. Now I'm going to build roads. I mean, all of these things that we wouldn't think of doing as an individual. Really, disaster recovery is the same way. It's got to be addressed as a community. And some communities are really making this important. You know, we've done a lot of thinking, or there's a lot of thinking going on right now about, you know, what are the characteristics that make one community more likely to be resilient than another. But we are just at that conceptual stage of this field now. We don't have any empirical data that I can say, we know for a fact that communities that have this characteristic. I can say that we believe a lot of things, and one of them is that the community itself is engaged in the process, that it's not just government making their plan and they're having this chain of, okay, this person's going to do that and they're going to report here and so forth, that the community itself needs to be
working on it together. You're reminding me of the famous 5 MGM movies in a row in the 1930s, the Mickey Rooney, Judy Garland backyard dramas. In the 4th act, their eyes get big and they say, I know what we'll do.
That was before my time, actually, but
Right. But we all know that picture, and I guess you're
Yeah, I
talking
know
about the
it
basis of
actually.
it. We'll put on the best darn show this town's seen, and they cut to a montage of everybody in the town working together on putting on a play, which has nothing to do with what the problem in the town was. But because they're all working together,
yeah, it's one way, yeah.
they're all
what-
together.
I mean, the good news in that, in a way, is that at least when you kind of look across what we do know, I mean, and there are a few studies that are relevant to this that I won't really go into, but you don't have to get focused on disaster. You can almost never really get a community focused on disaster preparedness, because we all know a disaster never happens to our community, right? It happens maybe to that community, but it's not going to happen to us until the most prepared people for disasters are those who had a disaster last year.
Right.
Because you tend to believe it the next year. But then, of course, you're disaster-proof by then. It won't ever actually happen again. But nonetheless, there are, you know, certain things that are pretty widely accepted. I mean, that I don't know if you want me. I won't go into those details here. But I'd say that as an area of scientific inquiry, it's so far behind where we are in understanding the individual, and I think it's really important to understand you know, what are the characteristics of communities. Okay, am I going on too long?
Go ahead.
Okay, like for example, you just take Katrina, because everyone knows Katrina. There was this one community, and everyone knows how, you know, awful the after effects of that event were. There was this one neighborhood out in New Orleans East that was astonishing. You go through all these miles and miles of desolation. You enter this community, and it's like going into another world. It was just as badly hit. It was a Vietnamese community, very close-knit, had extremely tight local leadership in their church. They got help. They got financial help from the national organization. They built a community. They all got back out as soon as they could. They were building a garden, selling them. I mean, it was amazing. And I mean, you kind of went through just studying this community.
Close-knit.
And it was more than close-knit. Close-knit sort of understates, because this had to do with leadership. It had to do with purpose. It had to do with building, having the shared bond with what it means to be part of a community, as opposed to just being, well, I want to make sure that me and my family are okay. Okay,
I think
we go.
it's consistent with what
Yeah.
we just heard. That is, my understanding of resilient communities is actually an extrapolation of what we have learned from the resilient individual. And that is, if your community is altruistic, that helps. If your community has a moral compass, that helps. If it provides support, economic and social, that helps. But it's an extrapolation from the individual character. Faith is another one. It's extrapolation from the individual to the larger community, tends to correlate with each other.
Reinforce each other. And George, you were we want to go. Do you have one more thing to say?
Well, I think it's just fascinating that what Fran was saying in the early discussion about altruism, that these are things that we haven't studied. And it's interesting because there is some research now that altruism, or doing things for other people, is consistently showing up as a protective factor.
Yeah.
And researchers kind of saying, imagine that.
Imagine
because
that.
we never bothered to study it.
And yet we tend to have people not help each other. We tend to want to put them in the role of being the helped rather than the helper after that.
But community,
That's a lesson in
what
that.
you said though is really interesting though, because, and you've been saying this for as long as I've known you,
Long.
which is like 50, 60 years.
At least.
But
Back when we were watching those movies together, so.
Mickey, Rooney, Judy Garland, right?
but it's just something we haven't quite figured out how to get at. And there was after 9/11, the Chinatown community did like 3 times as well as any other group, and
3 times as well by what
they
measure?
did their mental health was
Mental health was
extremely
better.
good. And this is not a statistical explanation, but what
And just to be clear, the Chinatown community is right under the towers, in
right,
effect,
yes,
nearby.
but
They
what's
were
interest-
affected. I mean,
what-
they had,
Right.
What's
effect.
interesting about that, though, is that they were just outside the zone of getting some of the aid that other groups got. They were closer. And this was not really, didn't get a lot of press here, but it got a lot of press in mainland China. And mainland China organized, and a lot of people said, the Chinese people in New York are not being helped, and money poured in. And that's a kind of a
Support.
broad connection to the broader, diaspora of Chinese people. That's an aspect of community that,
Well,
if anyone's out there that knows the real truth about this, I may have got it wrong. Just
well, to move, yes.
Yeah, I mean, there was a study on effect of PTSD on 2 Tibetan refugee community, and they found a much less incidence of PTSD.
I'm sorry, where again?
Tibetan refugees.
Oh, okay.
yeah.
So there was much less because the sense of, and they stressed themselves because of their solidarity and sense of community.
Yeah.
And just about the character, I think it's like a baseline. And if one thing that neuroplasticity, neuroscience, and meditation has shown, that a baseline is stable as long as you don't do anything about it. Your baseline of what we call character. If you just sort of keep on going, then probably it's certain stability. But if you intervene, either by mind training, then neuroplasticity shows within a month your brain starts to change. And the same, so unless you tap on the potential for change, then there's a certain stability. But then it can change. And we vastly underestimate that potential for change.
The potential for change. All right, well, to go to
Change is good.
a last question with the last little video. Can resilience be taught? We have a final portrait of resilience, a young woman from Staten Island, New York, who faces challenges every day of her life. How to survive being the target of bullies. How to survive a rough adolescence. How to get an education. Let's take a look.
My name is Ndeye. I'm a student at the College of Staten Island. When I was in high school, they used to bully us a lot and try to beat me up because I was quiet, and they was like, well, she's big for no reason because she's not gonna do anything. All she does is cry all the time. Sophomore year, I stopped crying and I started fighting back. And I finally exploded. I told my mother I can't go to the school anymore because I know somebody else is gonna say something to me and I'm gonna fight. So then we sat down with the assistant principal, and she said that she really feels that I should go to Concord because it's a smaller school. So I went to Concord, and around the second semester I was there, I had a science project with my science teacher, Ms. Pressure, and she wanted us to do a scientific mind training to see if we could train our mind or to relieve our stress level. At first, when they told us, we were all like, what are you talking about? it's not gonna work. We're all stubborn people, this is not gonna work. A doctor came in and she hooked us up to these brain monitors to see how our reactions were to certain things. And that day I was angry because of a girl that stole my iPod was sitting like in my direct eyesight. And I was looking right at her. And it showed that my anger levels was increasing my brain length and my brain waves were going nuts. I just averted my eyes from her. Like I looked at other people and it showed that my brain waves were calming down and they were slowing down. And the meter wasn't going as fast as it was before. So for 3 minutes, for 10 weeks, we did this. And I felt myself calming down more, like I would get less angry. And I used my training to stop myself from physical interaction. The goal that I needed to achieve was I had to graduate, and nothing was going to stop me from graduating. And if mind training was going to help me calm down and be a less angry person and would help me focus more on school, then that's what I was going to do. It worked. I graduated, and my next main goal is going to be to graduate from college, and I'm full steam ahead, and that's where I'm going. I mind trained mostly today to relieve stress, not because of anger, just because there's not so many hours of the day. I'm always busy between work and school. So if I can get 5 minutes a day, I'll be happy.
Matthieu, I was looking at your face while you were looking at that,
That was
and you were resonating a great deal.
Yeah,
And
that was a
indeed,
great story.
one of the shots of her just at the end,
Yeah.
when she was looking down, I had to say it reminded me of some of the beautiful pictures I've seen depicting the Buddha.
Yes.
You resonate with this story.
Very much so, yes. Because precisely, I mean, she found out by herself. You know, she had a kind of biofeedback by looking at her brain. And we have been doing that a lot, even in real-time fMRI. And you can modulate your compassion, 30%, 60%, 90%. And that shows how flexible the brain can be. And she found that within a number of days or months, she could have a much more greater emotional balance. So you see, the problem is we don't believe or trust that this basic quality can be trained. We trust that we can play the piano better, or tennis better, or play chess better, but how come we don't have the same confidence that we can train focused attention, mindfulness, loving kindness, emotional balance? But all what we do as meditators and all what neuroscience shows, that exactly within a month it starts to change. So she found that by herself, totally unprepared for that. And so that's so wonderful. And you wonder, when we don't have access to that, it's kind of a drama.
And indeed, we've been hearing for the last, I think, 10 years that a lot of Buddhists have been working with scientists because you know about this and you're happy to see the scientists being able to see it in your minds, in your brains.
We saw it with meditators that did between 20 to 50,000 hours of meditation. A violinist who does his first concert or her first concert is 10,000 hours. So the idea was, if we start with those, like the Olympic champions of the mind, and if we find differences, then we can ask, how did they get there? But that's not very interesting for society. Not many people are going to do that in the Himalayas. But what about if you do it for 8 weeks? And what is fascinating is that it starts very fast. And now there have been studies that within 4 weeks, you see structural changes in the brain, you can see neuron formation.
In only 4 weeks.
And then there was a study in Israel recently, 1 hour, it was not about meditation, but 1 hour of training, you could already see macro changes in the hippocampus, which is the area of the brain that processes novelty, already happening right away.
I would add a little bit of a proviso, though. I mean, you can see changes quickly, but to get sustained changes that last, you got to keep doing it.
Exactly.
Right? Because just the way we're talking about the brain as plastic, in a positive way, you can make things better, but if you don't keep doing it, it's going to go back.
Like dieting.
Like dieting, right?
I was thinking about the treadmill.
And the other implication of the work cited, which is really important, is that it's not just the brain, it's the body. So stress causes the hormonal changes throughout the body that increase your risk for heart disease, for high blood pressure. It makes diabetes worse. Many different metabolic problems occur when you don't have stress under control. And it starts with the brain, because the brain controls all of that. So if you got the brain under control, the body does better.
Well,
right?
the studies of 8 weeks of mindfulness-based stress reduction, John Kabat-Zinn's method, have shown precisely that you can reduce blood pressure 15 millimeters of mercury within 2 months, and you can boost your immune system. Even psoriasis, people go in UV things and they sit for half an hour. So when they sit doing nothing for half an hour, why don't they meditate? And then they found that it cures 30% faster.
Wow.
But you give me the impression that it's not hard to do this, but I actually bet it is hard to do. I mean, how do you get your mind to actually be mindful? How do you actually
piano is
be
not
mindful?
easy unless
you
you train.
It sounds really hard to me.
It's training, practice, that's all. We suppose you want to train in loving kindness.
But you know what I mean? You have to turn off all of those thoughts that are bouncing in my head, I have a concert going on at any moment. And I mean, I think there's really a lot more to this than you may even give yourself credit for being able to do. I think it's probably really hard work.
Not at all.
No?
So easy.
Okay, sign me up. I'm going tomorrow.
This is turning into a revival meeting.
I
But I must admit, listening to you, we hear about Buddhism as the path to enlightenment. It sounds to me like it may be a path to resilience.
Yeah, but you see, I think I would like to take the Buddhist close half a little bit. I mean, although I won't do it here, but because there's some universals. If a Japanese scientist finds a new particle, the particle is not Japanese. It's either there or not there. So there are techniques devised over 2,000 years. The Dalai Lama speaks of secular ethics. It doesn't mean to be against religion, but there has to be something that is applied to all, no matter what. So it's really about mind training. That's what meditation means. Cultivating skills, becoming familiar with a new way of being. So that is basically we all have same emotions, same minds. So Buddhists develop some techniques, but don't think it's only for Buddhists, of course.
But I think the reason that mindfulness meditation is caught on so much is because there's kind of been a meeting halfway between the West and the East. It's a huge brushstroke.
That's
But
right.
I mean,
No, I think that's
what we've learned in the scientific studies you've been involved in and others is that meditation enhances the kind of things that Westerners have wanted to enhance for a long time. And you can enhance them other ways through exercise and all kinds of other things. But we're seeing that this is a great technique for doing the various things that we think are valuable. And I would add that resilient outcomes are likely because, as I said earlier, that meditation would target, if I can say such a word, the 7 or 8 dimensions or 4 or 5 dimensions that we've associated with resilience, like keeping stress down, like being confident, like connecting to other people. So there are in fact other ways to do those things, but meditation is a great way to do that.
Well, let me take it to the other end of teaching it or passing it on. What about governments, government leaders? Can they do anything to teach citizens and communities? I'm also thinking of military leaders who have to decide whether somebody who's been in combat and come out and been traumatized is resilient enough to get back in. Are there ways to measure this? I mean, this is looking at it from not the personal meditative point of view, but
this goes back a little bit to where we're drawing our boundaries and definitions about what we're talking about. In one way, the very fact that we have a public education system may have been the greatest intervention for resilience that ever was, but that we don't think about it that way. But the very fact that, because education, think about one of the strongest predictors, and when he talks about the various studies, is always education. People who have, right? Isn't that true? Have you ever done a study that education didn't?
No, it's always there. It's always coming.
well, let's say this again. Education itself
Education itself, yeah.
Education.
teaches resilience,
Education
didn't-
predicts resilience.
Yeah.
predicts resilience.
Yeah, so people who are more highly educated are more likely to be resilient. Yeah.
And there's a lot of different things that might mean, but just in terms of, what is the role of government? I don't think that government is going to go out and have some campaign to make people more resilient. But
Not likely.
not likely. Or let's even say fund research on it. That would be really nice. But oh well, we won't go down that road. But nonetheless, the extent to which we build, communities with strong economic systems is absolutely critical. In fact, again, this is going back to the community level a little bit, but it very much influences the individuals within that community. Diverse economies are extremely important. So, in fact, communities that have, say, like a single industry, the one factory town, or they do very badly in disasters.
Yeah.
Compared to.
You can do the analysis across countries too, right? With economics.
And it makes a lot of sense. If you're too dependent upon one, they call it resource dependency, I think, in that literature. If you're too dependent upon, it's flexibility. It's really the same concept, but on a different analytic level.
Our schools can do a better job.
How so?
We teach health in school.
Yeah.
We could teach
We could
about
teach
some of the
better.
factors that we've talked about today.
That's right.
Mindfulness, exercise, altruism,
Some of the scientific facts
And
that
it-
being
you've discovered?
optimistic.
And it can be
This
integrated.
can be brought up.
It can be
We
integrated into
have
curriculum.
these young people in school for hours per day, and we could teach some of these things and give them a toolbox as they move on in their life.
Well,
It's not done.
It's now a subject of scientific study. It's responsible. It's not
Well, and
sounding
that's
like
where
you're trying to convert.
No, and that's where you build it in because, I mean, I think we all know the schools get inundated with everyone who's realized they have the kids, 6 hours a day, and so, let's do everything we want to do in the schools. And I'm sympathetic with that, but a lot of what we've been talking about it's science. I mean, you can teach that as part of the science.
So it can be
curriculum.
taught in a way that won't get people's dander up because it's now basic
it's
scientific
real.
knowledge.
It's
Just to
real.
make, you're suggesting that just to make students
It's really-
aware that science has a handle on these things, it's part of what to know about when you're growing up, as well as knowing about how the community works, knowing how the mind works for this.
Because everybody experiences the difficult life events that we've been talking about today. Everybody loses a loved one.
And science has now brought this general knowledge to enough of a level that the religions and the sciences and the sociologies are talking to each other in a new common language of this.
And that is happening to some extent. I mean, in New York public schools, my kids are in the New York public schools, and they have been exposed to meditation, they have been exposed to exercise and stress reduction and all those things in the schools.
It's not only what you teach, but for instance, the context. If we know that resilience is held by sense of interdependence, in sense of being together, mentoring, someone that you can rely as a stability. So instead of having competition in school, you should have more a cooperative type of education and mentoring.
Well, listen, I've got some good news. You can hear the applause beginning to break out. The good news is this, that all 4 of our panelists have said they'd be very happy to answer individual questions in the nice big lobby that's just out here afterwards. We're already over time. I'd like to stay here and talk to these folks for another couple of hours this evening, but we are out of time. So let's give them a big hand, and if you'd like to talk to them, they'll be out afterwards. Thank you very much.